All right, so I'd like to know kind of how you got into the mental health field. That would be kind of interesting to know because you mentioned that you're a substance abuse counselor, so
Mhm.
kind of drew you into that.
All right. In December 2011 is when I graduated from Western Kentucky University, bachelor's degree in political science. Um, and that was a adventure all on its own because I ended up dropping out my junior year of college in order to, I just couldn't afford paying for it anymore and had maxed out student loans. So I ended up dropping out. And uh, in order to get back into school to actually finish out my degree, I took a whole loop, joining the Army and getting tuition benefits. So once I finished with basic training and everything, I came back and finished my degree. I was in National Guard, so I was able to go to school full time, and then 1 week in a month do guard duty. And graduated in December 2011. In March 2012, I got a job at Rivendell UHS Hospital here in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and in a sense, kind of reverse sexism, I think is what you might classify it as. They looked at me, a veteran. They looked at me as a male, large stature. I'm 6'1" and probably around 300 pounds, and the the nature of the clients that find their way to Rivendell, even though it's primarily an adolescent hospital, it is the last stop for clients. They've exhausted um, elective or voluntary care. Most of the time, they're mandated to come there, and it's the last stop before they get criminal involvement. Um, Needless to say, there's a substance abuse, adolescent substance abuse unit there, and a lot of gang affiliation and um, well beyond oppositional defiant, definitely into conduct disorder and building the groundwork for antisocial type personalities. So these clients can be aggressive. And when I interviewed for this position, I didn't really have a choice. They told me, you're a male, you're a veteran, your size, you're going to work on this unit with these aggressive youth. The kids on the unit between 13 and 18 years old, um, but they just wanted, for security reasons, to have able-bodied people there. Um, um, so that's where I started in the mental health field. I was a tech at this hospital on an adolescent substance abuse unit, and was actually through working on that unit. I had no prior experience with substance use treatment, um, and I will appropriately disclose I had ample experience with substance use, though. I was a frat guy in college and a lot of alcohol consumption. And it was actually through working on this unit that I reflected on myself and addressed some substance use issues, just kind of taking what the program taught the clients. Uh, Kind of as I'm teaching the material to them, I'm reflecting on myself, and I'm like, hey, let me make a mental note. That's something that I can incorporate into my life, into my, cognitions and personal characteristics, and maybe benefit from it. And it wore off on me to the point that I adopted a drug-free, alcohol-free lifestyle. Um, and it was through working on that unit um, that the counselors, the psychologists that would work there, um, every once in a while I would get a compliment. Hey, I stepped in and I heard you teaching that group, and your understanding of that material is really thorough, and actually the way that you teach it, the clients have spoke up and said that you get through to them. They tend to understand your way of teaching. Um, Encouragement like that pushed me to eventually somebody said, you're getting really good at this. You should think about pursuing a career in mental health, not just as a tech, but maybe since you're doing substance use, seek out here in the state of Kentucky, we have what's called a CADC, Certified Alcohol and Drug Counselor. And the professionals in a hierarchy above me encouraged me to pursue it, and they convinced me, so I did. And that's how I ended up going down the path to get my CADC. I left Rivendell. I worked at a company called Journey Pure. Started there in 2016. So I spent 4 years at Rivendell, started at Journey Pure in 2016, and it was kind of my opportunity to start pursuing the CADC. I knew from working at Rivendell that I wanted to, but I hadn't pulled the trigger on that yet. When I got to Journey Pure, part of the interview process, I said, this is what I want to do. I want to know that there's an opportunity here for me to be supervised by another CADC in order for me to get it. It's part of it, you have to have somebody above you to supervise you. So I was hired as a case manager, but was allowed to spend time on the clock. I would get assigned a client here and there, and racked up my clinical supervision hours and all that until I finally sat down for my test, had all the appropriate education, had all the clinical supervision hours that they required, the Kentucky State Board required, and then actually got certified. So I worked at Journey Pure in Bowling Green. I actually moved to Nashville for a couple years. I worked at Journey Pure in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And then that brings me up to where I'm at now.
Okay, that's kind of interesting and cool at the same time that you went through political science. I took that course as part of my bachelor's in social sciences, and now I never really was much into the whole politics thing until I took political psychology, and there was a lot of personality psychology that was very interesting. Like you can look at personality traits like, say, openness and conscientiousness and agreeableness and their facets underneath there, and you can kind of predict reliably where someone might fall in the political spectrum. So like liberal types, for example, are high in trait openness and low in trait conscientiousness. So they're more open to ideas and they're less likely to put borders around things. And conservatives are high in conscientiousness, but they're low in openness. So they like to have things in borders, and there's procedure, tradition, things of that nature.
Compartmentalized thought. And
yeah. And then of course, conservatives are considered to be higher in politeness than compassion than, say, liberal types who are more tilted toward compassion than politeness, which is kind of interesting. And of course, neuroticism and extroversion aren't really considered factors for political belief and orientation, which is so I thought that was kind of cool, and that's kind of what tilted me toward personality psychology once I got out of undergrad and toward grad school.
And the thing there that I think is important to zero in on is when you approached me about participating and coming onto your podcast, the idea was we would talk about philosophy a little bit.
Okay.
That might be one of the things that we would cover. Not really a script to this, just kind of going with the flow, ad hoc.
I like to do things just keep it as natural as possible.
And that's where my foundational understanding of philosophy comes from, is from politics.
Yeah, I can see that. My introduction into philosophy was when I started listening to and reading Jordan Peterson's work, and he would always mention like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and all these philosophers that influenced his thinking. I was like, well, what he says makes sense, and I agree with to a great deal, but it's not enough to just stop at the source. I want to go back and look at the genealogy of the ideas. So that's when I started reading like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Heidegger, and started looking at some of the philosophical ideas that I don't agree with. And so then I started reading a lot of like Marx, and I've read about postmodern philosophy and trying to understand it, because I is I don't like conflict, but when I try to talk to people that I disagree with, I try to at least understand the philosophies that guide their ways of thinking. And for better or worse, it can get frustrating at times. But
Well, yeah, you have to pick your partner in that when it comes to a level of maturity. Disagreeing doesn't necessarily mean that you're an enemy with someone. It just means that you hold different values.
yeah,
And when you talk about going back to the origin, that's kind of what Socratic questioning is. Um, is that idea of having a debate.
mm-hmm. And through that, that's where I got my great appreciation for Jung. And so this is where I started, I guess, for better or worse, kind of incorporating Jung's work into some of our school discussions, because it's like, I think it's a shame that when it comes to like psychoanalytic theory, what they call psychodynamics, I call it psychoanalytic because that's what it is. I think I could be wrong there. Jung kind of gets swept aside, and I don't quite understand why we do that.
Mm-hmm. So the knowledge base that I have about Jung really comes from, and I've mentioned this to you before, I think in different platforms that we've been on together, is because of the historical influence that Jung had on the Alcoholics Anonymous organization. He really influenced a lot of the processes and theory behind the approaches that they use. As far as understanding his works, I'm very juvenile in that sense. I will say, hopefully this puts a smile on your face. You recommended Jordan Peterson's series about personality, specifically where he explains the Lion King movie through the lens of Jung, with some Freud in there as well. And I'm on part one of that. I haven't got to part two yet, but so far very detailed. I didn't expect that amount of detail. Looking at Jordan Peterson's, this might be a plug for him. Looking at his YouTube channel, there's so much content on there. I've got a YouTube, save to watch later list videos that I've said, hey, look, that looks really interesting. I want to save that, but I don't have time right now. My list of videos, I've probably got 10 to 15 days of content that are just piled up. I need to go through and watch and process. And a lot of, besides what you recommended about the Lion King and Carl Jung, a lot of the other Jordan Peterson videos looked really interesting. So I kept adding them on there. So I'll hopefully watch some of that.
Yeah, Jordan is definitely a big influence on my thinking and my approach to how I approach things. And like I said, for better or for worse, that's kind of I get, for better or for worse, that's probably why I think some of the professors that we've had have probably gotten a little frustrated with me because of the whole, well, one, my background in psychology, and two, it's like, I'm trying to get past just the surface stuff, and they seem to get kind of irritated with that because I think it's just we have so many weeks per class and they're just trying to get everybody through.
Yeah, I was full disclosure, I was a little hesitant to mention that we're taking classes together at the university because I didn't know if that's something that you included on your podcast. But knowing that you're open to that, yeah, it's unfortunate that an institution of higher learning is not a place where you can be free to explore in depth. Rather, there is an agenda, a curriculum that they have to follow, and the business side of universities limits the time that they're allowed. So, unfortunately, it tends to be very surface level rather than a deep dive into content.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about Dr. Sexton is that he took like 3 or 4 hours after class and just said, screw it, we're gonna if you want to hang around and have deep discussions, and we will most certainly do that, and we did, and I enjoyed it greatly. I have compared him to Jordan actually several times. That's who
I didn't realize that he spent that much time after class. I've talked to him offline outside of class through web platform. Um, those conversations have been at length, but I didn't realize that after class he would stay that long. Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh no, it's fine. No, I think it's cool that he's willing to do that.
Yeah, it's very respectable.
And so what made you switch from just doing drug and alcohol counseling itself to mental health counseling or psychotherapy, or however you want to describe that? What got you tilted toward that, you think?
An analogy that I have used to explain the position that I was in is a doctor. Imagine a medical doctor, an MD, getting a specialty like heart surgery
Mm-hmm.
before he actually completed his medical degree, his doctorate. That's the position I was in. I was pigeonholed. The short answer is business practices and politics are the reason that I chose to go back to school to expand my credentials. Legally speaking, CADC is only supposed to treat substance use issues.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that's not possible. The majority of the work that I do in treating substance use issues relates to anxiety, depression, trauma, social justice issues, environmental issues. There is a large percentage, statistical percentage, connection between substance use and mental health. And it is no longer practical to consider them separate issues. I think that at least the educated in the field have agreed on that for a long time. The legal systems, what they allow you to do is behind, so that's what it is. I couldn't ethically or legally treat clients sticking to my credentials and avoiding those issues. So I said, you know what, I've got to fix this. So let me go back to school. Let me expand my credentials. Yeah, there is a portion of it that is related to billing, right? Having the LPC credential makes me more billable, but also it fixes that ethical and legal issue where I can treat clients on both sides of the fence, their substance use and their mental health. But there's a little bit deeper portion of that. I guess you would say my conceptualization, I'm tongue tied here, my conceptualization of addiction is largely based on the fact I think that mental health issues, starting from a young age, it could be attachment issues, those compound over the years. I think that there's a factor of human nature that goes into it. We tend to practice avoidance quite a bit. The people that are predisposed to being substance users practice avoidance quite a bit. And as life goes on, we experience some traumas. That's just part of life. And I've found that there is a large number of people in substance use treatment who have trauma histories, but because of the way the substance use industry operates, those traumas don't get addressed. They might be identified through, say, an ACE assessment, adverse childhood experiences. So it goes into a chart to say, hey, look, we've calculated an ACE score. So consider that when you're thinking about the treatment plan for this patient. And something fell off my shelf over here. In the treatment plan, they may look at symptoms of trauma, such as anxiety or depression. treat the symptoms. In my mind, that's a band-aid. It's not actually a fix. It's just treating a symptom. So I've kind of gone on this personal crusade or passion. I want to use this new credential, pursuing through grad school, to allow me to focus my future in this career on treating substance use clients who have trauma histories, um, focusing the treatment on, how do I say that? Focusing the treatment on their trauma and hoping that, and I really do believe because of my conceptualization, that I don't want to use the word fixing, but helping these clients with their traumas that's gone unaddressed, avoidance, like I mentioned, facing it, dealing with it, processing it, learning to live in light of their traumas, will have a noticeable impact in a positive way on their substance use problems. Yeah, that's really what the motivation is, from going from having this CADC credential to pursuing the LPC, licensed professional counselor, is because I have to. I'm kind of at a point in my career where business practices and legally and ethically I have to, but also because it's a new chapter in my career where I can switch focus more to the trauma side rather than just the substance use side.
So going from a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down.
Definitely looking at the foundational issue rather than what's rearing its ugly head, chief complaint kind of thing.
Gotcha. And so you notice, I think if I remember correctly, when we were talking about theoretical or philosophical orientation, this is kind of where we get to indulge in the philosophical, is you mentioned that you study, you're more along the scientific model of like cognitive behavioral and dialectical behavioral therapies, and because it's more objective, let's say, that you can measure where someone's at in their treatments. Is that a correct is that a correct formulation of where you're at theoretically?
Yes, is the short answer. We've used different language to describe this, and through this grad school try to identify what's the right word to use. And integrative theoretical orientation is one phrase. Technical eclecticism is another phrase that I've heard. Basically, it's I've had a lot of influence throughout my career. So I've been exposed to a lot of different theories. When I started my career working at Rivendell, the entire hospital was not just DBT informed; they were a full-fledged DBT program.
Okay.
So that means that they taught individual skill groups. The milieu was ran in a way that the staff members coached DBT skills on the spot as they were needed. The counselors would render services and treat clients through a DBT lens. So from all areas, all interactions that these clients had when they were residential, it was all DBT, and that's really how DBT programs are meant to operate. Then out of nowhere, the hospital kind of did a little research, and they decided that they wanted to modify the hospital's services, and they pursued a program called 7 Challenges. So that was a background I got. Then you can't really do substance use treatment without getting into the AA or whatever anonymous peer support program, their philosophies. When I was doing my clinical supervision, I got exposed directly to the CBT, REBIT, rational emotive, REBT. I got just a whole, and from each of these, I start, over the years, probably, well, I started in 2012, the beginning, and it's 2012. So over the past 9 years, almost a decade, um, building this conceptualization. And research wise, they even say now that it's just really inappropriate to think that one theoretical model completely explains the human psyche.
Yeah, I agree
Um,
with you on that on a
yeah.
wholeheartedly. It's like DBT was considered the gold standard there at Central State, but
Mhm.
from my understanding, DBT is mostly best used with people with borderline personality disorder because it helps coach the coping skills that the what would you say great drastically reduces the self harm and suicidality in people with that disorder. And then
Mhm.
because of its successes, it's kind of it's like, well, we can take this and we can use it here, we can use it here, we could use it here, kind of thing.
um, the the thing that's really stuck with me, and this is to answer your question, is um, out of all the things I've been exposed to, I really have made the conscious decision to stick with um, evidence-based practices, mainly because that's smart, that's ethical, partially because insurance requires that. Um, you can't just go off script and make up your own thing necessarily. They want to have justification that the interventions you're doing work. So evidence-based is what I'm at there. And when it comes to DBT, for example, yeah, Marshall Linehan designed it for borderline personality disorder. Different research endeavors have applied DBT to other populations, measured outcomes, and they said, well, there's some reason that it works.
Mm.
And then some researcher says, oh, let's dig into the theory and try to explain why there's this correlation. Um, Take DBT and apply it to substance use clients. Um, the overlap between substance use and some personality issues like oppositional defiant conduct disorder. Well, DBT is based on a set of skills. Interpersonal effectiveness is one category that they use that teaches a person how to effectively live their life interacting with other people.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's perfect for a person who has some conduct disorder, some antisocial. Um, when you can give them a set of skills that, you talk about a hot button word, manipulation.
Yeah,
There's a skill in DBT called Deer Man, the Deer Man skill.
if I remember that. I remember seeing it in the books, but I couldn't
Yep.
tell you what it is right off the top of my head.
The Deer Man skill, the purpose is it's an acronym,
Uh-huh.
DEARMAN. Each of those is a different component of a way to effectively make a request. It's manipulation, not in a bad way though. So I kind of want to use the word manipulation, but I want to get away from that. Um,
It depath
Judgment.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like it
yeah.
depathologizes manipulative behavior instead of doing it for selfish reasons or what can you do for me. It's more like, okay, how can we take that baseline way of communication, but how can we do it in a way that works for you and the other person instead of it works for you kind of thing.
Yeah. And instead of a macro level, on a micro level, working with that individual client, you can tell them this is evidence based. Reflect on your past. Have you made demands to a person before, and how effective was that? So they gather evidence that way, anecdotal, but yeah.
Well,
um
it seems to me like it
oh,
would work with reality therapy in a sense too of, well, what is it that you want or need? What are you doing right now to do that? And then you can ask how that's working out for you or how has it worked out for you in the past. And it's like, okay, well, if
yeah.
not so much, then let's plan a new set of ways of doing things that would actually work.
um and that idea of using a foundation in my theoretical orientation of evidence-based, so cognitive or behavior therapy. Um, I respect the chronological progression from behavior therapy to cognitive behavior therapy, and understand the need for that evolution. So I don't really differentiate there. I think that it's kind of a natural progression. So lump them together in one category.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with that as a foundation, and then this idea of technical eclecticism, from being exposed to different ones, I've said, oh, hey, that if I'm working with that, say depression is a subject, I really like looking at. We talk about like psychoeducation and the neurobiological influence, that knowledge base influence on theory. If I'm working with a client with depression, I like going to neurobiological psychoeducation and talk to them about neurotransmitters and brain chemistry and brain anatomy and physiology, and explain the scientific basis of depression, and then link that. Okay, now that they understand what the cause of depression is, let's link that to why treatment is effective, why we recommend these treatment modalities: behavior activation, and then med management psychiatry services for SSRIs. And those two together stand the most likelihood of treating depression, that kind of thing. Then as a therapist, I also know that it goes beyond just brain chemistry. There's also some cognitive components to things. And, that's when I'll do a little bit more thorough work, and we start talking about logical fallacies, cognitive distortions, and start working on the mental processes that support the depression, that kind of thing. So yeah, we were, your question was, what was my theoretical orientation, how did it form, that kind of thing. And I think that's kind of explained. I was exposed to a lot, I found a core basis, and then this technical eclecticism has added into it whenever I've seen a need for it.
Yeah, I think that we both agree that the technical eclecticism or integrative approach is probably the best way of doing that. It's like when I first got into psychology, I was trained to, was in undergrad, I was trained to be more of a social psychologist, but like I said, I didn't like the research methods. And so I went toward behavioralism. And so like cognitive behavioral therapy was like the baseline thing that I was reading because it seemed like the most easily understood. Because DBT, it's because that dialectical process, it's almost like you're trying to have a debate with a client and trying to be like, where can we agree where things are right? Where can we agree things are wrong? Where can we disagree? And then you have to hash that out. And then you get to the skill building. I think that's the right way of thinking about that as someone who's kind of new to that modality. But as I kind of started reading more into the philosophy and stuff, that's the existentialists, and that's kind of that's predicated on belief in a sense that belief is manifested in action and behavior rather than it is in speech. And so that's kind of I guess that was my first introduction into the idea of existentialism and how people act out their beliefs predicated on their existence. Like it's no wonder people are depressed or anxious because life is very difficult. And if you believe that life is out to just existence is out to just beat you down, you're going to act that out. And so you kind of have to, and this is kind of where Heidegger's phenomenology of, the person's, thrownness into the world and how they react to that kind of goes into that. And then from reading Jung, it's like, I do talk a lot about the persona or the self or the shadow or even the anima and the animus, and try to explain, okay, well, what you're acting out is what you believe other people believe you should act out, and that's predicated on that. That's your persona. That's your public mask that you're using to kind of shield the ego and the self in a sense, because you don't want people to see the real you. You want people to see what you think they want you to see. And then there's the things that you
Mhm.
don't want to even acknowledge, and you sure as hell try to keep hidden from other people. And that's part of the shadow. That's like your darkest impulses.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Um, now the shadow, that's a Jungian principle, correct?
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
it's
yeah.
an archetype as well. That's
Mhm,
so the adversary, like you always talk about the hero and the adversary. So the
mhm,
adversary is pretty much like the hero's shadow, kind of manifested out in the world. That's
mhm,
Cain and Abel. You know, Abel was, of course, you know, the self, and Cain was his shadow in a sense, and that was like jealousy and all of that. You could think of it that way from a story
mhm.
perspective. Still trying to figure that one out, but yeah, that's what that is a Jungian archetype and concept is the shadow, and
Okay.
so
This might even sound a little, and I fully embrace these terms. I'm not using them in a derogatory sense. I love them. A little nerdy, a little geeky. I'm My entire life I've been a big fan of comic books,
mhm.
and when we talk about archetypes, that's how I picture these archetypes. I think of a different character that represents them. So I know that Jordan Peterson used the Lion King in that example, explaining some of these, but in my mind, that's the way that I'm trying to draw the connections.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's absolutely it's nothing but reasonable to kind of look at comic
mhm,
books and those stories because they are stories. Now, could we be elevating comic book characters to that as gods, or are we bringing the gods down to the level of the comic book character? That's an interesting question, but it's like you got Thor and Loki. Well, that's another version of, say, Harry Potter and um, Voldemort, or even
mhm,
Scar and Mufasa in a sense. You know,
mhm,
they're the quarreling brothers. It's like Cain and Abel in a sense too. And so, you know, Thor is the archetypal hero. Loki is the archetypal adversary, and in a sense, Loki is a manifestation of Thor's shadow in a sense, because
mhm.
Thor tries to be very constrained in his behavior and action, even though he can be a bit brash and arrogant sometimes. But Loki is all of those things, but times 10 or even times 100 in a
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, and those parts of Thor's character that you would describe as the shadow, the things that he absolutely does not want out. Um, uh, that exact set of personality characteristics is what Loki is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And so it's an interesting thing with clients, like for with anger management and assertiveness training. There's an idea of, okay, well, if you could let your dark impulses just out into the world, what would that look like? And most people will give
Mhm,
me a blank stare because they never really thought of it that way. It's like everybody has a capacity for evil and for cruelty and for all of these different things, and it's like
mhm,
it's in that you can incorporate that, and you can learn how to grow some teeth, let's say, or draw the line in the sand, say no and mean it. I'm
mhm.
sure when you're dealing with antisocial youth, being, because you come across as a very nice guy, but I'm sure there is a part
Thank
of
you.
you that you bring out that says, no, stop it. You're not going to act this way. And if you do this, then what you don't want to have happen will happen. And that's a warning, but it's a serious warning.
Mhm.
So there's probably a
Yeah.
part of you that comes out that does that. If I'm not, am I being too presumptuous in that?
No. I was gifted with the gift of aggression. That's one of the things. That's it's the only way that I know to word that. I think that Freud Freud had some drives, sexual drives, aggression drives, maybe even anxiety, if you want to connect it that way, that um, were explained as things that people tend to keep hidden
Mm-hmm.
because they don't mesh with societal expectations. They go against the grain. They're hard to incorporate, and yeah, I think that I've done very well about incorporating aggression, that Freudian drive. Um, so you might have even used a hyperbole explaining how to set a boundary. Um, Personally, in that instance, setting a boundary, most of the time I tend to be kind of withdrawn. Here's the facts. You have a choice to make. Um, and I'll enforce it, that kind of thing. So it's not a lot of emotion tied to it, like, you know, very exaggerated emotion. It's just, look, I'll support you if you want to make this good decision. I think it would be good for you logically. I can understand why you emotionally might want to make a different decision. Consider your consequences. Not that I'm the one giving you consequences, but just natural consequences of your decisions. You talk about an antisocial youth. You have a highly emotional, big emotion kind of episode, and you're not logical at that point. You make a decision that you want to punch a wall, something like that. You've seen that in the hospital setting.
Mhm.
Natural consequence of that is you hurt your hand, and that's most of the way that I go about. You know, occasionally have to use some. I I, I like some extracurricular reading on body language
Mhm.
as a way to communicate, um, and understanding the way that subconsciously body language is read by other people. So yeah, a lot of times, um, I'll give you an example. If talking is no longer a way to communicate with, say, one of these youth, um, there's a body language principle called power by proximity. I don't know if you've ever heard that before.
I'm familiar
Um,
with the term.
if you are trying to have someone who's maybe not adhering to the expectation focus and go, wait, am I doing something that I'm not supposed to be doing? Simply as a perceived authority figure, being closer to that person. Where I use, like, if I was doing group therapy, and I've got a kind of a screwball patient who's having a sidebar conversation. I don't have to verbally address the sidebar conversation. I can just get up and walk around the room. And if I tend to hover maybe behind that client's chair a little bit more than I do other clients, they start the body language starts, okay, wait, am I doing something? Oh yeah, I'm talking. And then they would stop. So not too often you have to do that. Most of the time in a calm, my obligation is to demonstrate to clients the behaviors that we want them to use. So in their highly emotive state, if I try to be the same way, I'm not helping them at all. So yeah, as far as incorporating aggression, a little bit, but
Okay. You had mentioned, like, going back to the political science thing. So, what interested you in political science?
uh this may not be related to our conversation, but I'm glad you asked. Um, when I was in high school,
Mm-hmm.
I was really gifted. I had a 4.2 GPA, I think. Um, I took the ACT in order to get into college, and I had a really high cumulative ACT score. However, my reading score was like a 14. It was horrible. And I had had a few experiences in high school that opened me up to um, politics. I attended Kentucky's Boys State, which is like a mock government political summer camp.
Mm-hmm.
Little nerdy,
It's
but
interesting.
yeah, basically, we went to Morehead State University. Can't remember whether it was our junior or senior year of high school, and we recreated the Kentucky Assembly and learned about the processes that go into it. So that was intriguing to me as a young man. Um, but I chose political science as a um, degree, path for my bachelor's because of that very low reading score on my ACT. I kind of asked myself the question, what can I pick that is going to force me to read and improve in this category? And I, I wasn't aware that pretty much any major that you take, there's going to be reading associated. I just had this preconception that oh, studying politics, that's going to be horrible, boring, long nights reading books, and I've got to force myself to do it. So, um, but I think it paid off.
Mhm.
I've got a little bit more expanded vocabulary. Trying to be humble when I say this, but even like the speed of my reading comprehension's gone up. So it really was just a self improvement opportunity. Matter of fact, I told you that I dropped out of college my junior year because I couldn't pay for it. I had to join the army. Um, when I was finished with basic training and I came back, I already had all of my core classes for the political science degree done.
Mhm.
But the university that I was going to, Western Kentucky University, required that a degree in political science required either a double major or a minor. Um, because I was a medic in the army and had some, biology and science kind of background to that training, um, my minor was in biology. The two aren't related at all.
Yeah,
Um,
that's pretty cool because my associates is actually in biology because I first started out doing computer technology, but it was boring and had no interest, and so I wanted to do the social sciences for my bachelor's. I knew that, but I needed like 3 classes as opposed to taking more to try to catch
mhm.
up. So I ended up taking anatomy and physiology, uh, my micro no molecular biology, and I forget what the other one is right off the top of my head. But basically, I chose like 3 or 4 classes and just went for a sciences rather than an applied sciences
Yeah,
degree.
yeah. It's weird that having no wisdom at that point in our lives and picking a major for your bachelor's degree. It was just happenstance that it worked out that way. The social sciences component of political science, because it falls under that umbrella,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, is what maybe gave me, like I said, the philosophical background, understanding some of the Socrates and Aristotle and John Locke and Martin Luther and all of their kind of revolutionary thoughts that built upon what we have now. Um, but luckily, when I applied, the whole reason that the University of the Cumberlands was attractive to me is because their graduate program required a bachelor's degree, but not a bachelor's degree in a certain field.
Yeah.
So it was a way for me to bridge the gap. Again, this is I put a lot of effort into going one direction, and midlife now I'm having to correct my errors of my youth. So there's really nothing that I could do with a political science degree. Um, or a minor in biology, So going back to grad school now is refocusing and fixing that kind of error of my youth.
Well, I don't think that there's an error there. I would say the political sciences, I think, makes you a formidable opponent if you have a. I'm not, and I don't think I've really can't say that I've had an adversarial professor, but
Mhm.
if you were to have an adversarial professor that's trying to, I guess, teach a certain worldview that you may not necessarily agree with or might challenge your own initial presuppositions, I would say that it would definitely arm you with a way to combat that, or at least engage in that intellectual combat in a way that would not
Mhm.
be detrimental, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. Could still do it in a kosher manner
Mm-hmm.
and be polite and stuff, but to have the argument to back it up, to intellectually say, well, if you're looking at it through your lens, which might be motivated by A, B, and C, that makes sense. But have you considered that other people might look through it through the lens of X, Y, and Z? And yeah, that I haven't thought about it that way. That might be a useful way to kind of change my perception of it, my skill set.
Yeah, yeah, because I think I've only had one adversarial professor here
Mhm.
at the Cumberlands that I've really butted heads with, and that's because our orientations philosophically are nowhere near each other.
Mhm.
And when it came to when we were discussing in one of the it was the diagnosis class, and
Hmm.
the lady was a self-professed intersectional feminist, and
Hmm.
we were talking about substance abuse actually. So this question you could answer from what you think with your experience, but I had
Lay
asked.
it on me.
So I'd asked, when it comes to the what I would say nihilism that you might find in substance abuse, the idea that there's nothing valuable or meaningful about life. So then, if nothing matters, then why not, either get yourself so doped out of your mind that it doesn't matter. You can just drink whatever the hell you want and who cares? And I had asked about that from a existential perspective, and I forget the way it was worded, but it's like she was like, you need to think about it at the intersection of identities as to what's going on. And it's like that has nothing to do with the nihilism component. And I had said that. And I forget how we had got on the topic, but I basically, when she brought up the postmodern approaches, I was like, I have a bit of a problem with postmodernism. And I laid out the philosophical axioms and how they're absolutely incoherent with one another.
Hmm.
And we just agreed to disagree, and that was the end of that. But the nihilism thing, the meaninglessness that you find with substance abuse, what do you think
Hmm.
about that?
I mean, I think that I think that for the majority of people, that nihilist perspective is a construct. It's a defense mechanism that they would use to justify their actions. Um, I think, how do you combat that as a therapist? I think you draw from, Viktor Frankl and logotherapy and the search for meaning. And it doesn't have to be profound. Um, I've had people that um, maybe they aspired to open a small business. I've had people that maybe aspired to um, build closer relationships with family members. Um, it doesn't have to be a lifelong pursuit either. It could be a temporary, defined pursuit that has, parameters that would say you've accomplished it. Even if that only lasts for a year or 2 years or something, that gives enough meaning for a person to combat that nihilist idea. And within that time, hopefully they identify their next uh, item or pursuit that gives their life meaning. Is that kind of the answering what you were asking? I feel like it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing, because I had asked if the nihilism was more of a symptom of the substance abuse, or maybe a cause, or maybe it's like a feedback loop
Hmm.
that you get to. Maybe there's some existential depression. You decide to get the substance into your body, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, some opiate or whatever, and then it's like,
Hmm.
well, nothing matters, so I can just keep doing more, and it's like a positive feedback loop that just keeps feeding into itself. Um,
Okay. Okay. Here you go. When you reminded me about the connection that you were kind of thinking between nihilism and existentialism. Um, with existentialism, you've got existential anxiety,
mhm,
right? Neurotic anxiety,
yes,
a little nuanced between the two, but essentially, it's the idea that um, you have obligations, you have responsibilities, and you're not meeting them. You're even if it's the choice you're making is not to choose, right? So when I mentioned earlier avoidance,
yes,
that's where I incorporate those two. Avoidance of a cognition uh, is you're choosing not to choose. And that's going to result in that. And I forget the exact nuance difference between them, but that's going to result in the existential anxiety, the neurotic anxiety, one of the two. And that is uncomfortable, right? So whether you want to consider that a mental component or because it does not cause a dopamine release, a neurobiological component, we don't like that feeling. And we're repelled by that. We want to avoid that. The result is substance use. Substance use is the escape. It's the temporary fix because one, it blanks your mind, right? I don't have to think about that thing that makes me uncomfortable anymore. For this moment, I get to escape from it, right? I think that's a very primitive drive, right? I could tie that back to biology, and again, it's a very primitive drive. You touch a hot stove and it burns, you withdraw your hand. You experience an emotion that's uncomfortable, you want to withdraw from that as well. So substance use allows users to achieve that end. Because of the dopamine release tied to the substance use, they're reinforced, right? This is simple, operant conditioning.
Yeah.
You're reinforced about that substance use, cause and effect. It achieved what I wanted, and when there's the dissonance in a client's mind about, oh, ethically, is substance use right? No, I probably shouldn't be, all these derogatory terms that a person might call themselves as a substance user. Well, how do they justify that? That's where the nihilist argument comes in, is they say, well, there's no meaning at all. And I'm not trying to make them I'm not trying to insult when I say that.
No.
But it's completely logical to me, at least the way that I can conceive the concept of addiction and how the brain works, for them to go, I've got here's DBT for you. Two arguments, right? Usually cognitive behavior therapy would say, cognitive behavior therapy, something like that would say this or this, right? Either or. Dialectical behavior therapy, from a little different perspective, says, why not both and?
Yeah.
Right.
Two things at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. Two diametrically opposed ideas can occur and exist at the exact same time, even though they don't make sense together. Right. With this idea of addiction and nihilism and existentialism, it makes perfect sense for the user to pursue that path of avoiding the negative thought, escaping from it through substance use, supporting that with the justification or argument that life is meaningless, and if there's no meaning, then why should I strive for a higher standard? That makes perfect sense. And at the same time, that same person has, here's your feedback loop. This causes another set of thoughts, which is guilt, anxiety, existential anxiety, neurotic anxiety. The conflict between what that person's values and beliefs are and what their actions are showing, right? They may believe that they should hold themselves to a higher standard at some, core level, but then their actions of using, and like we just said, it makes perfect sense why they would do it, but their actions are not in line with their beliefs, and that is a whole nother topic.
That's
That's really
the congruence there that Rogers was talking about where you can say what you can predict what people believe by their actions. So you could say that a user believes that there's really no meaning in their life because that's what they're acting out. Now they can say that they believe that there is something to their life and they should be held at a higher standard. And this is where Rogers would say, okay, well, let's take what you're saying that you believe and what you're acting out, and let's get them more in line with one another, so that way you're not disintegrated and incongruent and disintegrated. I think that's the right way of thinking about that.
So integrated Okay, I'm going to have to remember that myself and reflect on it. So my background out of the AA and program and substance abuse, this concept that you and I are discussing of beliefs, values, in inner beliefs and values not being in line with outward expressions and actions. This is where I start getting into I would use the word spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
not religion, right? Not dealing with a deity, that kind of thing, but in here, spirituality of, I guess the simple way to put it is, when your beliefs and values are in line with your actions and you're not conflicted, that's healthy spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Versus when you're out of alignment, right? You have dissonance. Now you're spiritually unhealthy. You're filled with this internal conflict. Uh, all that just weighing on you, constantly causing chaos in your mind and your thought processes. This being diametrically opposed and not knowing how to resolve it. That's unhealthy spirituality, and it sounds like, going back to this theory, when we talk about our predecessors, Jung, Rogers, Freud. It sounds like they would use a phrase. Maybe you said integrated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah,
I can see that.
that's one of the words that, because Rogers talked about incongruence and congruence. Jung would say that you would integrate the parts of your personality
Congruent,
into an
integrated.
individuated personality, and
Okay.
and so it seems to me that it's not unreasonable to say that a person who's what they say they believe and what they act out, when they're not congruent with one another, it's disintegrated. Because what you want to do is, like
Okay.
you said, you want to take what what they say they believe and what
Mhm.
they actually believe. That's the action part. And when you try to integrate them together to where what they say they believe and what they act out are the same, so that would be congruence
Yeah. Yeah.
or integration. You could, I think the two words can be used interchangeably. I think you could do it that way. And but I like the way you really brought the existentialist point of view in onto the substance abuse, and really kind of really hit the nail on the head on that it's not so much just a symptom of the substance abuse or a cause of it, but it's probably manifested in that incongruence and dissonance within the individual, which is something I hadn't even thought about. So that
Yeah. I mean,
would be something to sit there and meditate on as well.
that's just the language that I've learned to use to explain that concept of uncomfortability because things aren't lining up, right? Something in my head, I'm my existence requires that I make a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And even if my choice is I'm choosing not to choose, um, it it results in that. I think it's neurotic anxiety. I'd have to go back and look at my theory book, but I think that's neurotic anxiety. And it snowballs from there.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, very much. So it's funny, a job is what kind of got you into the substance abuse counseling, and now mental health was because of the job at Rivendell. Is that what it was
Mhm.
called?
Yeah, think of J.R.R. or J.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit, and that whole thing, Lord of the Rings, Rivendell. Yeah.
Rivendell. Okay. Um, I was interested in history and stuff like that, and that's kind of what tilted me toward psychology in a sense. Because, like I said, social psychology was where I started, and then I went into behavioralism. And it was because I was interested in societal conflicts that happened, particularly, World War I, World War II, and all the
Hmm.
consequences of each of those. And then
Hmm.
it was when it was really when 2016 happened that it was very bizarre, the reactions of people that I knew when Trump was elected. It was a lot of
Hmm.
irrational, emotional reactions to that, and then epithets like Nazi and all that started being flung about, which I didn't understand and why that was the case. So I kind of went back and looked through like the history books, and that's when I started reading more about not just Nazism and fascism, but communism and Marxism as well. And it's like, it seems to me that things have kind of gone off the rails quite a bit. And so that's when I started really taking psychology really seriously, as to trying to understand what the hell was going on.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that people aren't being taught history properly. And I think that that's where a lot of the confusion as to why we're readily willing, and when I say we, I mean as a society, different ends of the political spectrum are willing to throw epithets at one another. And I think it is due to historical ignorance and not understanding the psychological consequences of the 20th century, and not as well as the historical context of what happened. What do you make of that, since you have that political science background?
Um, it's a lot to digest there. Um, some of the things, like thoughts that ran through my head, is I think there's a um, phenomenological explanation for some of it. We're not in 1940s, Allied and Axis countries where telegraph and radio and television are, primary means of communication, and post. Um, we've got social media platforms nowadays. And that's a whole pet peeve or soapbox anyways. I think that societally, part of the problem with that is people have become too emboldened about using certain disrespectful language. Um, People don't say things like that face to face with another person. And face to face is where you would experience some consequences for being disrespectful. By saying it in a social media platform where you don't have to deal with those consequences, you get more and more bold, and that's a runaway train that's affected society. Um, when I talk about the language, disrespectful language that a person might use, and um, I understand that sometimes you use a word to explain a concept. Um, I think in this was something we talked about in a comparative politics um, class that I took. Let me see if I can think of an example. Uh, I think at the time that I took the comparative politics class, there was a news article going around, a story about in the East China Sea, um, two boats, um, and I'm going to use language here that's maybe non-biased, collided.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And depending on who wrote the news article, the word that they used to describe that occurrence changed. Um, for even the when you talk about grammar and the use of the language, um, possessive. I'm not an English major, obviously. Here I'm stuttering over my own words. The verbs, the nouns, the conjugations. One news article might say, and don't hold me to this because I might be misquoting it. A Taiwanese boat rammed a Chinese naval vessel, right? So the person who did that action was Taiwanese, right? And their action was not a passive thing, it was an active thing. They rammed that boat, right? So making, and the way that sentence is set up is it establishes the Chinese naval vessel as the victim. Whereas if you read it from The Guardian right? Completely, quarter of the way, third of the way around the world,
Mhm.
unbiased. They might say two vessels collided in the East China Sea, right? And now you've got a totally different story.
Yeah, it seems like
That's
it was just an accidental thing that happened. Yeah.
um, and that is how media can spin some things. Your choice of certain words. So tying that back to the social media thing, instead of talking about President Trump's press conference or the journal article or news story. Instead, you start saying their political agenda,
Hmm.
their propaganda, right? And just changing those words and knowing the historical way they've been used and what images that brings to mind. Um, eh, eh, it demonstrates the people who use those words how they feel about it, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of the same way that profanity is.
Yeah.
Sometimes people use profanity to communicate a strong emotion, right?
Hmm.
And when you combine that in this nexus that we're dealing with social media, um, people having a louder uh, platform that can reach more audience than what historically they were able to. You don't need the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times anymore to reach that number of people, to reach that audience. You can have an Instagram account with 1.5 million followers that reaches the same number of people. So different um, different people that historically wouldn't be heard are now being heard. Um, and you could probably do all kinds of research into that with, okay, what is the average education of the person who reaches 1.5 million people with their message? What is the uh, political affiliation, or how do they lean, um, compared to, do it as like a longitudinal thing, comparing that to say World War II, you mentioned, so the 1940s. Different people are being heard now just because of the way that society has changed and technology has changed.
That's a very valid point. Uh, I've unfortunately this is toward the end, so I want to say thank you
Mhm.
for coming on. I'd love to have another conversation because I think there's a lot of things that we could really get down to the deep level, but unfortunately I don't
Mhm.
have much time. But
Yeah.
again, I do want to say thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for asking me. That's a big honor. I appreciate it. Um, Definitely opened up my eyes. I do feel that we could talk at length, and it's interesting to see the just coincidence of what motivated you being a political environment at the time, and I've got a background in political science, and we both are in this school program, grad program together, and it just seems to be a lot of circumstance that overlaps about our stories. So it makes for an interesting conversation, I feel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for having me, man.
Well, thank you for coming on, and you have a good rest of your afternoon.
All right. See you, Sean.
See ya.